Hi, before we get started, I just wanted to say a couple of things. This is just part one of a two-part video series that I'm doing about the fear of the declining birth rates. This was mostly a direct response to the US pushing to rid the right to abortion and birth control for women. This first part, I'll be going over and dismantling the arguments, logic, and ideologies of those people who are pushing to increase the number of births. The next part will be more about the medical side of things, like the biases in medicine and treatment and the risks, tolls, and the lacking care of pregnancy, childbirth, and aftercare, as well as running the costs of having children, amongst other things as well. And also, while I've been producing these videos, PhilosophyTube also released her own videos arguing against the seriousness of the declining birth rates. Oh, and of course, she did a two-parter as well. But I've made sure not to watch those yet. I'll probably watch those after this part has been uploaded. As one, I don't really want to start comparing myself to others, especially a very well-established and respected video essayist, even though I've been doing that anyway. And two, I didn't want to see like a really good point or perspective I hadn't considered and feel a need to go back and do some rewrites to squeeze it into my script. And likewise, I didn't want to see a point that might have been very similar to one of mine, because that would make me very anxious that people might think I'm just plagiarizing. And that fear would also make me want to go back and change my script. And I didn't want to just completely change what I was doing just because somebody else did something very similar. Yeah, so to avoid all that stress and whatnot, I've just simply not watched the videos yet. Also, I wanted to say, in hindsight, I realized I talked very negatively overall about having children. I want to make it clear, I don't think having children or wanting to have children is a bad thing. This is more so about the freedom to choose to do so or not. Also, in the description, I will have a link to a Google Doc that has all the links for all my research. And with that out of the way, cool, let's get into it. Thanks.
It's in, folks. Women just aren't baby making as much as they used to, and now the whole human race is in danger. Thanks, women. Birth rates have been declining globally. Just look at this graph. But the last 2 years have been higher than the 4 years prior. Yeah, no, shut up. Overall, the number of birth rates has been increasingly diminishing since 1950. In the last 20 years alone, we have had a 17% decrease in birth rates globally. This equates to about one arm and a pinky less per live birth today. However, this trend could have devastating effects on the species long term.
But why are people having less children? How are the pro-family advocates trying to amend these issues? And is a diminishing population even really a serious enough issue that requires more attention than climate change and genocide? All this and more on tonight's episode.
Part 1. So, what's the problem? In the book Population, Progress, and the Case for People, authors Dean Spears and Michael Garuso suggest that within decades we will fall over the titular spike of the human population peak, and go on to proclaim that the population will diminish to such a level that, while not detrimental on its own, would mean that we wouldn't be able to acquire or produce enough resources to avoid an existential calamity. So instead of fixing issues that we currently have, which make having a family more and more difficult each and every year, we should not worry about that and instead worry about something that might happen in the distant future instead. Like maybe an asteroid might hit the planet hundreds of years from now. I don't know. That is an actual example they use, by the way. In an attempt to explain why bringing more children into an increasingly impoverished world, the authors write, and I really want you to remember this line, more of us generate more ideas, and that can mean better lives for each of us. And while it is notorious that not a single person alive today has ever produced an idea, let alone one that makes lives better for each of us, I'm gonna go break some ground and give it the old college try.
What if instead of campaigning to restrict abortion and birth control to help increase the global population, to help prevent a potential calamity, we use the current resources we have already accumulated to prevent a current calamity like climate change.
We could also distribute resources to the masses that are indeed alive now, giving more people better access to healthcare and education, making the population much healthier and more intelligent overall. As prices are going up and up each and every year, it is becoming increasingly more difficult to afford to have kids, let alone to ensure they have a high quality upbringing. As things are going the way they are right now in the West, more people means more struggle and less resources for the working class and below, unless we do something about it soon. This means more people are having harder times, quite the contrast to the line I quoted before. More people generate more ideas, and more ideas can mean better lives for each of us. Their logic falls very much on the quantity over quality idea, and sounds very similar to the whole, oh well, let someone else clean up the mess later mentality. Ignoring and unknowingly exacerbating current ongoing issues in an attempt to increase the population, believing this will increase the chances that someone else will come along and solve all our problems for us so we don't have to now. But okay, let's say the decline in birth rates is such a pressing issue, it requires our immediate attention above all else. How do we begin to analyze this? Well, let's take a look back in history at a population spike that was so big, we literally named the preceding generation after it. The post-World War II baby boom. World War II was one of the most horrific times for so many people in recent history all across Europe and the West. Many people, mostly men, were conscripted or voluntarily signed up to fight the cause. And by cause, I mean fight and die on the behalf of the people who started the war so they don't have to. These people were pulled away from their homes and families with no guarantee they'll ever see them ever again. The war did end, and the lucky soldiers who survived got to go home and see their loved ones again. And then they did what I'm sure most of us would do after such an ordeal. They fucked a lot. This caused a tremendous spike in the global population, but this was most apparent in the US. North America's population grew by about 14 million people between World War II and 1951, when the birth rate started to decline again, which is well over double the birth rates we have today as a comparison. The following numbers I'm about to present in regards to human population levels and estimations come from worldometers.com. But I do want to mention that I did look at a few different databases and they each varied slightly. So take these numbers with some leeway, but at most there was only a 2 to 3% difference. And I'm also about to throw some really big numbers at you, so yeah, just be ready. The latest date Worldometers had with any information regarding population prior to World War II was 1927, in which they estimated a global population of about 2 billion people. 24 years later, in 1951, right when the baby boom birth rate started to dip again, the population grew to be an approximate 2,536,927,035. This was a total increase of about 26% of the entire global population. This spike was one of the largest spikes ever. So we will look at the most recent 24 years so we can make some comparisons. In 2001, we had a population of about 6,254,936,459. Today, we have a population of about 8,231,613,070, or a total global population increase of over 31%, which is quite a bit higher than 26%, isn't it? And that is with a birth rate of less than half of what it was during the baby boom as well.
Yo, so I didn't mention this, but I'm sure people are going to say something about how life expectancy has increased, which is resulting in higher populations without disparaging the issue of the declining birth rates themselves. So I quickly want to say that argument really doesn't hold much weight when you consider we still had nearly 2 billion new people born into this world over the last 24 years. That's a huge increase both regardless of and irrelevant to a higher life expectancy. Also, if you actually look at the life expectancy growth over the last 24 years, it really doesn't amount to much either. In Australia, for example, since 2001, the life expectancy has only increased by 4.1 years for men and 3.1 years for women. Hate to tell ya, but those numbers just aren't doing much over the grand scheme of things. Sorry.
All this data shows that our population has reached such a size that our population growth rate is still accelerating at record paces. Just look at this graph. And let's not gloss over that over the last 24 years, we had a population increase of just under 2 billion people. That is 6,600 times more people born during the baby boom. Sorry, but the math just isn't mathing. The UN estimates our population will peak at about 10 billion people in the year 2080, and then slowly decline over the following centuries as our declining birth rates catch up. The data on their projections only goes up to the year 2100, however. And they got these estimations based on trends seen in most countries from 1950 until now. To calculate these projections, they looked at data on fertility, mortality, and migration, considering thousands of variables, including all sorts of things ranging from HIV prevalence to the mortality rate in infants under 5. What they didn't consider, though, are factors such as the imminent increase in death and migration caused by climate change, or likely potential increases in health issues, homelessness, and death as more and more people are becoming impoverished in even well-developed countries such as the US. Simply put, the UN's estimations are just that, estimations, based purely on trends and not considering what is actually happening in the real world beyond the declining birth rates. And what I think most people miss is that current major events and societal issues do impact whether we actually want to have children or not. And fixing those issues will likely encourage more people to have children. For example, easing the fear of financial stress without having to compromise a healthy work-life balance. Because let's actually think about the children for a moment.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Because if the parents are spending most of their time at work and away from the child, this can lead to some psychological developments in the child which can affect their relationships later on in life, such as having abandonment or trust issues. And as I am writing this, the average worker can barely afford to cover their own cost of living, let alone afford to raise a child. And on top of this, all the extra financial strain and exhaustion caused by more work hours causes more stress on the individual, which does affect the home environment and therefore the well-being and upbringing of the child. Not to mention, less money means less resources for the child as a whole. This can result in multiple issues such as malnutrition, lesser educations and opportunities, and less access to healthcare and so on. So maybe Dean Spears and Michael Garuso, instead of worrying about an asteroid that may hit Earth in 1,000 years, worry about resource distribution for the impoverished and working class in case someone in one of those groups gets pregnant. You know, the very goal that you're pushing for. Oh, and strive for better healthcare too. And I don't mean just for the child, but for the child bearer as well. Maternity and post-maternity care is so offensively neglected, and I have a lot to say about that, but that will get its own chapter later on. And let's not forget that raising a child takes a lot of time, energy, and sacrifice, causing you to probably have to give up on your ambitions such as career goals and hobbies. And maybe somebody just wants to live a life in a way that doesn't require the compromise that having a child requires. Combine that with all the other reasons I listed earlier, and I think it's pretty reasonable for someone to not want to have kids. So when I hear reasoning such as Dean Spears and Michael Garuso's that the population will diminish to such a point where, while not detrimental on its own, but potentially detrimental due to insert hypothetical situation here, I just don't buy into it. I can't see how an invisible hypothetical in the far distant future should take any precedence into anything that's currently happening in the world now. And I don't believe the goals of people like Dean and Mikey and anyone else who advocates for increasing birth rates are being as altruistic as they sound. Because if the objective is to build a strong well-being for the people of the future, why is there very little consideration of the well-being of people today? Yes, birth rates are declining at a steady pace, but the wealth gap between classes and the cost of living compared to wages is also increasing at a steady rate too. And assuming those trends do in fact stay the same, as those concerned of the declining birth rates assume that those trends will stay the same, this will have a far greater consequence before we even hit that population spike. If there are relatively only a few people who have ownership or control of most of the world's resources, what difference does it really make if the population is any lower? Increasing or maintaining the population as it is now just means we'll have more people competing for scraps. And let's actually think about this for a second. What actually is a healthy population level for our species? Well, that's a pretty tough question to answer, and it really comes down to what considerations you want to factor in. Overpopulation.com references 3 different studies in which they each consider the wealth of the people, access to resources, human rights and well-being, cultural diversity, our impact on the ecosystem and preservation on biodiversity, and support for intellectual, technological, and artistic creativity. And the results for those 3 studies are 1.5 to 2 billion people, 3 billion people, and 2 billion people as optimal populations for us as a species. So is pushing or forcing women to have more babies really a plight for the human race? No, I don't think so. This all really stems from the conservative and traditional pro-family values that have been pushed onto people all throughout history. And I believe, as in my opinion, is that any attempt to rationalize a reason to encourage or coerce people into having more babies is purely inherited from outdated traditional-esque beliefs and ideals we inherited from the generations before us. Whether or not people like Dean Spears and Michael Garuso are aware of this or not. Okay, so now let's discuss the whole pro-family concept. Part 2, you're not against family, are you? Before moving forward, I should also point out I will be referring to parents and married people in gender binary terms. I know that's not how things actually are, but the whole pro-family concept kind of revolves around gender stereotypes and gender roles, so I'll be speaking through that lens. Well, what do I mean by pro-family? I'm talking pretty generally about anyone who upholds or supports the traditional family structure. You know, the picture perfect husband and wife and 2+ kids. Or, you know, any typical variation of that. And I'm not talking about just anybody who has a family or wants a family. I'm talking more about people who follow a very traditional family-centric value system, or has a belief that settling down and starting a family is like an essential part to life. People who will settle down and have a family because they feel they have to, not necessarily because they want to. Let me explain. These family-centric ideals have been very prominent in society throughout history and have been pretty fundamental in our development of cultural landscape. However, they also come with some very glaring issues that have been deemed by many as problematic. And despite the name pro-family, it has always been more about upholding the power in men and controlling women over the well-being of the family itself. Treating the idea of having a wife and kids is like a goal to be achieved regardless whether you're fit to be a parent or not. Because it's not about being a good parent or the quality of the upbringing for a child. Otherwise, they would be pushing more people into adopting children, and there would be less of a stigma in dating single mothers. Because it doesn't matter how good of a father you are, raising another man's kids is typically looked down upon by other men. But what is not considered by the other men is why the biological dad is out of the picture at all to begin with anyway. The idea of settling down and starting a family as your primary goal in life is rooted alongside various patriarchal systems in which we get these traditionals from, such as religion. And okay, I can hear your eyes rolling, but just let me explain, okay? The nuclear family structure as we know it today didn't actually come about until the 13th century England and Europe, according to many historians. Although some believe it came much later in the 17th century alongside the rise of capitalism. And this makes sense as the nuclear family household only became a viable financial unit because of capitalism. The relationship between capitalism and the pro-family mentality has always been symbiotic. Capitalism is dependent on workers, working, and it can be a pretty hard sell to ask someone to give up most of their time, their energy and autonomy, doing all the hard labor for mostly somebody else who is already much better off than you in life. So there had to be ways to encourage and motivate people to do so. One has always been to implement societal pressure onto an individual to meet certain expectations, otherwise be deemed a failure or worthless. One of these expectations was to get married and to have children. This goes hand in hand with one's need to work hard to succeed. Because if you can't find a woman to marry, then it must be you who is inferior or undesirable. So, to impress her, you were expected to compete with other men to show that you could provide more for her than the other men could, which was usually shown off via material wealth, which could only be acquired if you work hard enough. But to work that hard means you don't have time to maintain a household. And it also means a lot of extra stress for you to deal with. So you would need someone to take care of those things, and that's what a wife is for. So you need to get a wife to take care of you so you can work, and then you would need to work to financially provide for the household. See how it just like goes around in circles? This is what both men and women, but mostly men, would strive for because they were each conditioned to believe this is what their role in life was. The marriage was more like a mutually beneficial transaction. And you can actually still see this logic in people today, mostly from like conservatives or incels and other people in manosphere circles, and also in apolitical people who never question the traditional values that society was built from. These pro-family ideals were just one of many carrots and sticks to encourage men to work during the development of capitalism. Of course, it wasn't just the feeling of being a successful member of society that encouraged these men. Having to work so much of our time and energy away can create a feeling that we are losing autonomy over our own lives, and this can cause a yearning for control or dominance. And that's why having the title as the leader or the head of the house is so enticing. But these titles also will internalize and give us a mostly false sense of importance. You know, I worked really hard all day, so I should come home to a nice dinner and a happy wife. The sense of entitlement that because we are the ones earning all the money off the backs of our labor, that we ought to be catered to and have all our needs met. On top of that, the traditional marriage system also internalizes into us a sense of possessiveness and ownership. You know, her name becomes yours. Therefore, any assets she have are now under your name. She is being integrated into your life, so she can support you and only you. Her style and overall attractiveness is also a reflection of you. A factor of a man's success in the eyes of others was also brought on about by just how attractive his wife was. Her beauty wasn't just something to gawk at, but it was something to show off to other men. As men, our value was always external and determined by our successes. So we would primarily have to focus on things like our career and reputations. But of course, this would mean we wouldn't have the time to do housework or look after the children, so those tasks were generally relegated to the women. The actual family side to all of this was secondary. It was supportive. It was an accessory to his status. The man would lead the household, earn and thus control all the money, and do far less of the work, and have his needs met through somebody else's labor. Which sounds an awful lot like the relationship between a boss and their employees, doesn't it? Just, I want you to sit on that for a minute. But of course, this dynamic has been shown to be very unhealthy for everybody. Men are being taught to bury and not express their feelings so they can be strong, stoic leaders, which alongside the long labor hours has led to many mental health issues, depression, and high suicide rates. This has also led into having serious difficulties when trying to form strong emotional connections with other people, which also leads into some severe anger issues. Now combine those mental health issues with the sense of importance, sense of entitlement, and sense of possession that I mentioned earlier. The women of the house were the ones who were expected to deal with all of that, being both emotionally supportive while also being an emotional punching bag themselves. And there wasn't really much they could do about it for a long time, as they couldn't earn their own money and get out if they needed to. And should they have ever gotten overly emotional or resistant or act out in a way that wasn't expected from them, it was likely they were met with physical or sexual abuse, or even lobotomization or institutionalization. When you hear the nuclear family, you might very well be picturing the 1950s, as this time period is commonly used as positive examples of traditional values and gender roles. Of course, in reality, it was during this time that men held most, if not all, of the power within a relationship. Domestic abuse against women was extremely prevalent in this era. And it was by the 50s that the gender roles and dynamics were pretty much set in stone. Men could just beat their wives and the women could do basically nothing about it, as domestic violence in this time was just one of those things that people didn't openly talk about. And police would very rarely intervene if reported at all. And because women would spend most of their time at home homemaking, this typically meant they were generally a lot more cut off from society and therefore had far less support networks than people do today. It was these conditions that mostly sparked the feminist movement that gained a lot of traction around the late 1950s. By the mid-60s, more and more women were earning degrees and entering the workforce. This would, of course, mean they could earn their own money and not be dependent on a husband. It is interesting that the same era that women started to gain more rights and freedoms is the same era when birth rates started to decline. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. In 1960, the FDA approved of the birth control pill for married women. This, of course, meant that wives could now actively choose not to have kids and forego their careers. But this was only for married women. For unmarried women, this meant a man could still get her pregnant against her will, basically forcing her to marry him and lock her in as a caretaker for the rest of her life. But the feminist movement persisted, and by the late 1960s, they managed to get more laws and protections against SA and domestic violence. In the US, divorces then peaked between the 1960s and 80s. This was due to women becoming more independent and divorce becoming much easier to go through with new no-fault laws and such. And since then, less and less people are getting married at all. Many pro-family advocates blame women and feminist ideology for the impending doom of our species, seeing how the declining birth rates almost directly correlates with the rise of women's rights and freedoms. But what I personally took away from these trends is that it shows just how many people, both men and women, really don't actually want to get together, settle down and have kids, and that they only did so because they felt they had to, but now given the opportunity not to, they're just not doing it as much. But even then, so many people do go down that route today because they feel they have to. Looking back at the 1950s, it looked as though for women having children, it meant settling down to a life of servitude and homemaking where compliance was just for survival. And having children for men was more about the status and having a household to lead, giving him an outlet for his need of control after compromising autonomy for all his work hours. But the actual responsibility of raising the child itself, especially in the earlier years of the child's life, would typically be mostly passed off onto the mother. And once again, it seems like neither parent did this out of a desire to, but because it was their role in life to do so. Making the family itself exist was what was important, not the well-being of the people who made that family. Capitalism constantly requires more people to generate more capital, i.e. more babies. And having more babies requires pushing gender roles onto society, and conforming to more gender roles basically means less freedom for all of us. Pushing to increase birth rates was never about maintaining a healthy population. We were already destroying the planet at a quarter of our current population.
It was never about the well-being and development of our species. Because if it were, then the pro-familiers in power wouldn't be trying to take birth control and abortion rights away. They would be trying to make the cost of living more feasible so more people can afford to have more children. They would be investing in better medical practices and developments to make births safer. They would be investing in more midwives and better aftercare treatment for parents who have just given birth. There would be better financial compensation to the parent who has to stay home and look after their child, and better pay rates across the board for the parent who has to go back to work. The modern pro-family movement was always about upholding patriarchy, perpetuating gender roles, controlling women, and manipulating the working class, who were mostly men at the time. And no, I am not suggesting that everyone who holds onto family values hates women and the working class. But these beliefs are problematic because it leads to enabling issues such as taking women's right away, such as the right to abortion. So why are there advocates pushing for a more traditional family structure rather than, say, the current living standards? Well, I personally believe this is just a defensive response in the rise in calling out gender roles and traditional value systems. When we are brought up with a certain belief system, it is very hard to break away from those beliefs, even when shown evidence to the contrary. And when those beliefs are deemed problematic, we will get
get very defensive to preserve our egos. Of course, there are other cases where people who are pushing for these pro-family traditional value systems are the ones directly benefiting from it. I find it really difficult to hear any concerns regarding the declining birth rates without considering it is extremely likely they are just excuses to perpetuate submissive roles onto women, whether the people issuing these concerns are aware of it or not. But hey, let's hear them out and let's actually hear out their concerns. Part 3, long-termism, or excuses. With that new perspective on the push to increase birth rates in mind, let's go back to Dean Spears and Michael Garuso, who tried to approach this from a scientific angle. Spears and Garuso seem to fall in that facts and logic mentality, or in other words, stubbornly defending your beliefs with cognitive bias. I'm sorry, but it's hard to make a strong scientific case to increase birth rates based purely on projections and hypotheticals. So let's discuss the authors themselves then, shall we? Michael Garuso is a well-established economist who worked with the Biden administration in 2023 to 2024. Dean Spears, another economist, specializes in the health and well-being in children, especially in India, where he has many concerns and interests in the air pollution brought on by climate change, which I think is pretty cool, actually. Like, he does seem to be somewhat interested in current issues, right? Both are professors at the University of Texas, where they both work for the Population Wellbeing Initiative, or PWI. This institution specializes in the study and research of population trends and fertility rates and the like, and is actually run by Dean Spears himself. Now, I mentioned earlier, I believe that any case for increasing birth rates stems from defending traditional values that are baked into our subconscious. Both Spears and Garuso are very heavily invested in the long-termism ideology, which is what I really want to dig into. Okay then, so what is long-termism? Well, it is basically when you believe that the people of the future who have yet to exist hold an equal amount of value of the people of today, because they will/could exist someday, and therefore their well-being ought to be something that is considered and prepared for, which on paper sounds all well and good, right? You're like, yeah, that's cool. But when there's a lot of resources being dumped into institutions like this, while simultaneously the working class is becoming much poorer year after year, and the cost of living keeps going up, and wages are not meeting the cost of living standards. So yes, by investing resources into institutions for people yet to exist and neglecting the people that currently do exist, it is showing a precedence of the people who don't even exist yet over the ones who currently do. Now, this line of thinking does mirror that of like another very prominent social belief. What was it? It was very conservative, like pro something. It also favored people yet to actually exist over the well-being of those who currently do. I don't know. I've lost that. It'll come to me later. But yes, long-termism is very pro-life of the future. Dean Spears himself actually wrote a paper in PWI about the issues long-termists have regarding the decline in birth rates and their goals in overcoming those issues. The paper, titled With a Whimper, is very much a precursor to their book, utilizing much of the work done in PWI. The paper opens with a quote by long-termist William McAskill. "Future people count. There could be a lot of them. We can make their lives go better." This quote, within the context of attempting to increase birth rates as opposed to dealing with more immediate and detrimental issues such as climate change, really shows, in my humble opinion, a really piss poor judgment in priorities and problem solving. Another issue I have is that this isn't real science. This is just ideology hiding behind academia. The only empirical data they really have to go off is current trends. And also, this focuses way too much on hypothetical situations hundreds to thousands of years from now, meaning they can't ever be proven wrong within their lifetimes. Great for the preservation of the ego, by the way. Many of their claims feel more like thought experiments or fear-mongering. Like, for example, if the birth rates stay the same, there will only ever be 30 billion more people ever to be born again. Or another way they like to put it is, there have been about 120 billion human births so far since the beginning of our species. So that would mean that humanity is now 4/5 over, only 1/5 remaining. I shouldn't have to point this out, but there is no way of knowing when, as a species, we're all just going to collectively snuff it and go extinct. So of course they have to make most of their claims with terminology such as may, could, and if. High fertility used to mean 6 children per woman. Now it means 2.5. Before long it may mean 1.8. Yes, it is theoretically possible that against all historical precedents and against contemporary evidence and high quality forecasts, a sticky high, fertility emerges to stabilize the population. It is also theoretically possible and simpler that under an unprecedented social change, a new high fertility norm could sweep the globe. It is the starting point of an argument for prioritizing the well-being of the near endless stream of future people, or more specifically, people who may exist if humanity can evade the nearer term existential risks that threaten it. The last example is my favorite because it really highlights the irony that they can indeed acknowledge current ongoing existential risks, but prioritize brushing those risks off to the side in favor of thinking about people from the distant future with no possible insight into any of the cultural or societal shifts or state of society at large for those people, or even how today's existential risks could impact humanity's ability to thrive and develop hundreds of years down the line. It baffles me how they can acknowledge these problems do in fact exist, but don't seem to factor into their own concerns of a dwindling population. For example, in this next quote, they directly compare the birth rate decline to climate change, but somehow also don't connect the dots that climate change may affect the population total in the long run. Externalities are economists' classic case where markets fail. Nobody, no country, and no family has an incentive, never mind ability, to individually solve this collective problem. So leaving an externality to run its course would make things worse, not better. Carbon emissions are a classic externality, so the solution is policy, public action, subsidized technological change, and coordination. If depopulation is indeed an externality that requires a public policy response, then there would be advantages to understanding the situation sooner than later.
Spears even acknowledges that they aren't certain about any of their projections.
You may be asking, how can we be so sure that global fertility rates will fall below 2 and stay there for centuries? Our first answer is, we are not sure, of course. No one should pretend to be sure that without intervention, destructive AI will be invented, or that an asteroid will cross Earth's path, or that the supervolcano below Wyoming will erupt, nor when. But long-termists take these risks seriously, damn it. We should take the uncertainties of low fertility seriously too. Because how could they be sure? This is pure speculation. While long-termism does separate itself from traditional pro-familyism by being far less about upholding gender roles and expectations, it is still quite dangerous in other ways. And no, not just because encouraging people to severely compromise their lives and health to have kids that they don't want to have is kind of fucked up, because there are people out there that will see this side of the birth rate argument, the side that doesn't affiliate itself with political belief, and be fooled by the academic pretense and believe this shit. And they will take these beliefs and spread these harmful views around as a scientifically backed or proven concept. But once again, if you just break all this down, it's just speculation and hypotheticals. Like, seriously, take a look at this graph they actually used in the paper and tell me you can take any of this shit seriously. It looks like he drew it up during a fucking earthquake and forgot that using different colors to differentiate different lines is a fundamental part of graph design. Long-termism follows a very similar logic to that of the anti-abortionists.
But instead of considering the potential life of one person that may be alive one day, it considers the potential lives of everybody who may be alive one day. But this also makes their claim sound much more catastrophic, like it is some calamity that we have to deal with. And in a similar way that the anti-abortionists prioritize the existence of a child above considering the well-being or the conditions of the people having the child and the environment that the child is to be brought up in, long-termists prioritize the existence of future people above considering the well-being or the conditions of the current population or the environment that the future people will live in. Okay, so this educational institution, PWI, is really just a place to push and develop long-termism, but how does an institution like this get established in the first place? Well, it was founded in 2001 and was only really established and developed after receiving a huge donation by pro-family spokesperson and all-around dipshit Elon Musk. Because of course it was. Elon, oh please sleep with me, Musk, the proud inventor of the Roman salute and nothing else, happily funded the institution with $10 million. Okay, now I guess I gotta talk about Elon Musk. Part 4. Elon Musk is a dickhead. I mean, a great depiction of why repopulating the Earth is just incel mentality. Muskie himself has been very vocal about his borderline melodramatic beliefs that unless women be having babies, the whole human race is in danger. He has publicly made it his mission to repopulate the Earth and spread his musky seed around wherever possible. He is allegedly offering millions of dollars to let him impregnate you and then will continue to pay you to raise his child alone. Wow, what a bargain! This was all mostly brought to light by conservative Ashley St. Clair, who claims that recently she has given birth to Elon Musk's child in late 2024 and was offered $15 million and then a further $100,000 every single month until the child turned 21 for her silence regarding his involvement. Of course, this didn't come to be, and when she outed him, supposedly he drastically cut back financial support, which also does seem to line up with his ex-partner Grimes, who has been seeking legal action against Musk for dodging child support. And then supposedly he reached out to cryptocurrency influencer Tiffany Fong, asking for her to let him get her pregnant, despite that they've never spoken prior. Elon Musk has 14 children that we know of with 4 different women. So he does seem to be fairly proactive in his ambitions to save the human race. Is that really what drives him? Or is he just another conservative douchebag trying to uphold and maintain the very traditional belief system that he very much benefits from? It's that. He's literally the 0.0001%, and he's always held those very traditional conservative beliefs. In 2010, his first wife and mother to 6 of his children, Justine Wilson, published an article which I am about to quote a lot. In this article, Justine explains a lot about Elon's views and behaviors when it comes to marriage and relationships. And it turns out he was always very controlling. She first met him at her first year at Queen's University. He said we'd met at a party I knew I hadn't been to. He invited me out for ice cream. I said yes, but then blew him off with a note on my dorm room door. Several hours later, my head bent over my Spanish text in an overheated room in the student center. I heard a polite cough behind me. Elon was smiling awkwardly. 2 chocolate chip ice cream cones dripping down his hands. He's not a man who takes no for an answer. Much later, after they were engaged, he would pressure her into signing a post-nup agreement under the guise of a financial agreement in which it would state that should they get a divorce, nothing he said or did during the marriage could then be used against him in court. She did end up signing this agreement because at the time, the idea of getting a divorce was silly, as I'm sure it would be for most fiancés and newlyweds. So while she was devoted and getting ready to build a life with him, he was already covering his ass in case things don't work out. And something I think we can all relate to, in hindsight, she does recall a lot of red flags, but during the relationship, she would ignore them or let them go. For example, during their dance at their wedding ceremony, he firmly told her, "I am the alpha in this relationship." I shrugged it off, just as I would later shrug off signing the post-nup agreement. But as time went on, I learned that he was serious. He had grown up in the male-dominated culture of South Africa, and the will to compete and dominate that made him so successful in business did not magically shut off when he came home. This and the vast economic imbalance between us meant that in the months following our wedding, a certain dynamic began to take hold. Elon's judgment overruled mine, and he was constantly remarking on the ways he found me lacking. I am your wife, I told him repeatedly, not your employee. If you were my employee, he said just as often, I would fire you. In 2002, they had their first child, Nevada Musk, who tragically passed away from SIDS. Justine was devastated and was spiraling and depressed for many years, whereas Elon Musk stayed true to the stoic leader archetype that so many men are pressured into. Elon made it clear that he did not want to talk about Nevada's death. I didn't understand this, just as he didn't understand why I grieved openly, which he regarded as emotionally manipulative. Despite being an up-and-coming author, Justine was slowly being conditioned into being nothing more than a supportive role in Elon's life, where her career and ambitions were always secondary to his. When he was home, his mind was elsewhere. I longed for deep and heartfelt conversations, for intimacy and empathy. And while I sacrificed a normal family life for his career, Elon started to say that I read too much, shrugging off my book deadlines. This felt like a dismissal and a stark reversal from the days when he was so supportive. When we argued over the house or the kids' sleeping schedule, my faults and flaws came under the microscope. I felt insignificant in his eyes, and I began thinking about what effect our dynamic would have on our 5 young sons. In 2008, she was in a fairly nasty car accident, and she states that her first thought wasn't, oh thank God nobody's hurt, but instead, oh no, my husband's going to kill me. This is when reality struck for her. I barely recognized myself. I had turned into a trophy wife, and I sucked at it. I wasn't detail orientated enough to maintain a perfect house or be a perfect hostess. I could no longer hide my boredom when the men talked and the women smiled and listened. I wasn't interested in Botox or makeup or reducing the appearance of the scars from my C-sections. And no matter how many highlights I got, Elon pushed me to be blonder. Go platinum, he kept saying, and I kept refusing. This is pretty typical controlling behavior for men who view their partners as something to show off, like a prestigious painting or a piece of art rather than a human being you want to build a life with. He feels like she is a reflection of him and therefore she should look the way he wants her to. Oh, and because she isn't human in his eyes, she must put the work in to cover up and hide any imperfections that we all literally have. Like, is he even attracted to her, or just like the idealized version of her that he is imagining in his head, regardless of realism? These alpha male controlling men like Elon Musk live with the belief that everything must fit around their goals, ambitions, and success. He required her to be supportive, and if she wasn't compliant, then she would be a liability. I told Elon, in a soft voice that was nonetheless filled with conviction, that I needed our life to change. I didn't want to be a sideline player in the multi-million-dollar spectacle of my husband's life. I wanted equality. I wanted partnership. I wanted to love and be loved the way that we had before he made all his millions. Elon agreed to enter counseling, but he was running 2 companies and carrying a planet of stress. 1 month and 3 sessions later, he gave me an ultimatum. Either we fix this marriage today or I will divorce you tomorrow. By which I understood he meant our status quo works for me, so it should work for you. He filed for divorce the next morning. I felt numb but strangely relieved. This ultimatum is a good example that men like this view relationships as one-sided. That men are to be at the top and the women are to be subordinate, and not an equally contributing partnership. Sure, he may have actually loved her and wanted her for who she was at the beginning, but his goals and financial success was always the priority. Elon Musk's eldest daughter, Vivian Jenner Wilson, has made a strong effort to distance herself from her father as much as possible. She's taken on her mother's maiden name as well as refusing any financial aid from her dad. This is most likely due to her coming out as trans in 2020 and her father's less than progressive views on the topic. She also identifies as a leftist, which very heavily conflicts with Elon Musk's very right-leaning, conservative, and patriarchal views. A lot of Elon's insight into family and procreation can be seen in an interview he did for the Daily Wire with nobody's favorite Seinfeld character, Jordan Peterson, which I actually did have to sit down and watch twice for this video. Aside from just having some hilariously awkward moments.
What's your oar in the water in this particular? This is the worst medical and psychological malpractice I've ever seen anywhere, including what I've done.
They discussed a multitude of topics, one being gender-affirming care for minors, something they are both very opposed to. Elon's reasons are a result of his experience with his daughter's transition, who, for context later, was formerly known as Xavier, by the way. In the interview, he proclaims he was tricked into signing the consent forms. You know, just like how his ex-wife was pushed into signing a prenup paper under the guise of a financial agreement. He claimed he was tricked by doctors who told him that if he doesn't sign those papers, Vivian will go on to continue suffering from depression and possible suicide.
I was essentially tricked into signing documents for one of my older boys, Xavier. I was told, Xavier might commit suicide if...
He speaks about it as though he wasn't fully aware or very understanding of the procedures involved, or really just like the situation in general, which tells me he wasn't ever really listening to his child about the dysphoria, nor taking their issues seriously at all. Because I feel like if your child is suffering from gender dysphoria, you would care enough to listen and take the time to learn about such things, such as gender affirming surgeries and HRT, before getting to the point of having to sign consent forms. He then stated that when Xavier transitioned, his son died. He wrongly describes the term dead naming to reiterate that his son is now essentially dead. Described as killed by the woke mind virus.
They call it dead naming for a reason.
Yeah,
All right, so the reason it's called dead naming is because your son is dead. So my son Xavier is dead. Killed by the woke mind virus.
At no point does he mention now he has a daughter, or that he is excited for her, or even really acknowledge her existence at all, in any capacity, seemingly only valuing Vivian as a son and not a daughter. Or possibly Elon only accepts his child for how he wants them to be, not for how they are. But what personally stood out to me when he was talking to Jordan Peterson about his concerns for gender-affirming care is that it seems that his real issues behind all of this is that the process sterilizes the teenagers who undergo these procedures.
You have them sterilizing drugs, which are called also a misnomer, puberty blocker. These are sterilization drugs, so they can never have children again.
Because that's what this was always about. Having more children. And I don't know if it's because his daughter doesn't align with his belief system, or if he's just transphobic, or if it's a combination of the two. But the mental gymnastics he did in order to push and justify his own beliefs is insane. He believes that the woke left manipulated his son into thinking he was a she, and thus required gender-affirming surgery, which he then believes the doctors tricked him into signing consent papers for, with the intent to sterilize his son and essentially kill him. And instead of acknowledging that his son is now his daughter, whether he agrees or not, he would rather deem her dead and killed by the woke mind virus, in which he then sworn revenge on, rather than trying to reconcile with her. Isn't he supposed to be smart or something? By blaming the woke mind virus, he is creating a singular antagonist in the narrative to himself that he can fight against without having to compromise his own belief system or have his beliefs challenged by accepting his trans daughter. It's all just very typical ego-driven denial. Given the word of his ex-wife Justine and his more recent failed relationships, and his really disgusting propositions to women with the intent of getting them pregnant, it is pretty clear he fails to connect with women on a human level. And if that article is anything to go by, it does show that he is very controlling within relationships. When he desires a woman, he really just desires someone to look good for him and produce his children. You might recognize this kind of mentality in incels. His daughter even called him out for being an incel after a particular tweet he posted directed at Taylor Swift back in September 2024. "Fine, Taylor, you win. I will give you a child and guard your cats with my life." This is extremely creepy and gross on multiple levels. It does suggest that he believes that making her pregnant is like some kind of reward, or that she should be honored to let him do it, which is like making me sick saying it out loud. This tweet was made in response to an Instagram post made a day prior when Taylor Swift announced that she was supporting Kamala Harris in the 2024 election, as well as calling out the Trump administration for lying and using an AI image of her endorsing the Trump campaign. She signed off her post with "Taylor Swift, childless cat lady," which is what Elon was referring to with the whole cat bit. And with that context in mind, especially knowing where Elon stood with the Trump administration during the election campaign, Musk's tweet really does sound a lot more threatening now, doesn't it? A report done by the Wall Street Journal claims that Elon has made inappropriate offers to at least 3 women working under him and was in a relationship with another, all of which have remained anonymous. In 2017, a woman fresh out of college was hired by Elon Musk, most likely due to a brief hookup they had during her college years. When she was hired, she was immediately put onto Elon Musk's executive staff so they could work more closely together, which the other staff noted as odd. And of course, this caused her to not be taken as seriously by the other execs. She had visited Elon's home multiple times during her employment, but was unhappy at her job due to Elon's frequent attention. Supposedly, he was texting her all the time, and she received very little respect from her co-workers. Reportedly, she didn't really want to be with him, but she felt pressured to because she was trying to establish her career as an engineer. She left after 2 years in 2019. A flight attendant for one of Musk's company's planes reported that he exposed himself to her and then offered her a horse in return for performing sexual acts and massages. She rejected the offer, and then suddenly her shifts got cut back quite drastically. This resulted in a $250,000 settlement. In 2013, another employee who worked directly with Musk himself was reportedly offered to have his babies on multiple occasions. Later, she was denied a raise, and then afterwards, Musk would complain about her performance, according to other employees. And in 2014, he was reported to have another sexual relationship with another employee. So with all that in mind, it becomes pretty clear that Elon Musk is just a controlling creep who uses his money and positions of power to pressure women into sexual relationships. His belief that he needs to repopulate the earth is just an excuse that he has convinced himself so he can justify his disgusting behavior. Because if it really is just about increasing the human population, why not just donate sperm to women who are already looking for donor inseminations? Well, that's because he's just an incel looking to fuck and is unable to connect with women. And so he uses the woke mind virus as a vessel of denial to block out any possibility that he is undesirable and therefore doesn't need any accountability or any growth on his end. All resulting in him having to offer random celebrities and influencers millions of dollars just to sleep with him. And I believe he is seeking out these women with like a high social status, like celebrities and influencers, because he is desperately trying to feel worthwhile to women of the status, ironically missing how pathetic it looks when your best pickup line is, "Please sleep with me, I'll give you millions of dollars." And when that fails, he'll just seek out women whose shifts he can hold back should they reject him on a bad day. Elon is an excellent case study that shows that the pro-family mentality is just intrinsically tied to conservative and patriarchal belief systems, which tend to value women for not much more than their baby-making abilities, encouraging both men and women to seek out having children to be labelled as more successful than those who don't. And given the societal power imbalance between men and women, this is potentially quite fucked, as it is a lot easier for the man to get the woman pregnant and make her keep it at his will and not hers. There's still tons to talk about, but this is getting really long, so I'm going to cut this into 2 parts. In the next video, I'll be going over the medical side of things, which will go into like the toll of pregnancy and the inequalities in the medical system, and I'll also be talking about the financial side of things as well. So See you then. Bye.